conversations with our founders, held in celebration of this 50th year of the Sleep Research Society. I'm Sonyan Kohli-Israel, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and Chair of the Sleep Research Society Presidential Task Force on this 50th year of the SRS. In this series of conversations, we will learn from the men and women who both founded and sustained the field of sleep over the last 50 years. Our hope is that you, our viewers, those of you who have been in the field for a long time and those of you new to the field, will understand where we came from and understand our history, because it is only by knowing our past that we know how to go forward into the future.
Hello, my name is Katherine Sharkey and I'm an assistant professor in psychiatry and human behavior and medicine at Brown University. And today I have the honor and pleasure of interviewing one of our founders, Dr. Rosalind Cartwright, who is Professor Emerita in the Graduate Program of Neurological Sciences at Rush University Medical Center. And I'm just so thrilled to get to talk to you about some of the good old days and the new stuff. So we should get started. And I think a good place to start is how you first got interested in sleep. So in your book, you talk about sleep having been an important part of your family life.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yes.
I wanted you to tell me more about that.
Well, my mother was a big dreamer, and she loved to tell her dreams at the dinner table and intrigue us all with decoding the images. And she used her dream images very much in her poetry. She was a published poet, and my father would sit there and shake his head in wonder and say, "Stella, you have such an interesting nightlife." And that was where I got the title of the first dream book.
Yeah.
It was called Nightlife. But he did not dream. She did, at least their recollection. She had a rich dream life. He said he had not. That intrigued me as a kid. That people differed in. I had many psychological questions that I carried over from my childhood. That was one about the dreaming. And the other one was that my mother was convinced that sleep was a healer. Anything that was wrong with you, if you slept
on it, it'd be okay.
You would wake up feeling better in the morning. Sleep was a big healer. And I said, well, that's kind of magical. I wonder if it works, and if it works, why does it work? And does it ever not work? And then why does it not work? So, I grew up with the conviction that sleep is interesting. And when I went to find a graduate program or even an undergraduate program, I could find nothing that was being taught about sleep. And Freud was definitely old hat. We'd discarded that long ago, and he was even a dirty word. You don't talk about that because that's not scientific. It's
Right.
not empirical. And empirical was the big word that I learned my first days on campus. Was the key to everything. It's got to be empirical. I didn't even know how to spell it. I couldn't look it up in the dictionary. But
you learned quickly. I was going to say, quick study.
Learn.
So psychology then turned out to be a good fit?
Psychology did turn out to be a good fit because even though I couldn't learn sleep and dream work as an undergraduate or as a graduate student, there still was no sleep. It gave me good training in how to think through problems and how to formulate them so that you could test them, and to go with what really interested you in terms of research.
Yeah.
And, my first department when I went to Cornell was a brass instrument department. It was old-time perception work, and they didn't like women, and they didn't want to encourage women to be students. They wouldn't give us assistantships. It went to the men. And so they gave me a hard time.
And that's where you got your PhD?
No.
Oh, that's where your undergrad?
Oh, no, I did get my PhD, but I went into the Department of Sociology and Anthropology to do my assistantship because they were
At Cornell?
At Cornell.
Got it.
And the chairman of that department was a social psychologist, and a very good one. And he trained me really in social psych methodology, and that's where I did the empathy measurement studies that took me to get hired by Carl Rogers, because he was interested in the idea that empathy was a measurable characteristic of people. And if you were more empathic, you might be a good therapist.
Right, I was just going to say, the empathy, I'm sure, played right into what he was doing at that time with that mirroring therapy and being in the moment with the patient.
Absolutely.
So that's what you brought to bear. That was your postdoc then, basically, or did you were junior faculty there?
Yes. Well, I was a research associate. They couldn't give me a faculty position. I'd been faculty for 2 years at Mount Holyoke.
I see.
After my graduation from Cornell, I went and taught for 2 years, and the girls adored me. And I said, I don't know enough to be adored yet. I better go learn something more. I need a research job. So I looked for a job, and luckily Carl and I hit it off.
And is that when you landed in Chicago?
Yes.
And then stayed and stayed?
Forever and ever.
That's great.
Almost forever.
So tell me, so sleep was sort of cooking in there, up here.
Yes.
But you were doing the work with Dr. Rogers, and so then how did you get to, you alluded a few minutes ago to, you developed this belief that you could do what you wanted to do. So how did you kind of tack the boat towards that direction?
Well, luckily I had a secretary who was Pat, Mrs. Dement.
Oh, Pat Dement.
She was not Dement then. She was my secretary courting Bill Dement, who was a medical student working in Kleitman's lab at night.
I've heard of him.
You've heard of him. Indeed you have. And she would come in, all breathless in the morning.
It's smitten.
Plunk herself down next to my desk and say, do you know that the eyes move when you're dreaming? And I'd say, that's very interesting, Pat. Go back to work. We have work to do here. Missed it cold.
Something?
Missed the whole implication cold. Took me 10 years. Once I was through with the psychotherapy project, the effectiveness of client-centered therapy, and the book was out, and Carl was off doing other things, I said, I need a new area. And that's when I went over to the University of Illinois Med School, and I was queen of that area. I could hire and fire, and I had a budget, and I had control over space.
Wow.
So I said, I'm going to find some space for a sleep lab. So I called up Al Rechtschaffen, and I said, I want to get into the sleep business. How do I do that? Hadn't got a clue. And he said, come on over. I'll amalgamate you to my new graduate students as they're coming in. I'm training them in the fall.
Oh, great.
And just join the group. And he made me very welcome. And he was great. He gave me an old 4-channel
recorder.
We called it the tea kettle because it would rattle like a tea kettle on. It was full of noise. And the channels were full of noise.
Oh my gosh.
And he'd look over my shoulder, he'd go around to everybody's paper charts and say, clean up the noise on those channels,
They are.
Do this, do that. But he was a very good teacher. And he was very generous with his time with me. When he thought I knew what I was doing enough that he would let me go on my own, I had commandeered some space.
Yes, I'd like to hear more about that space, if you don't mind.
Well, there was the psychology department was part of the space. Had been an old psychiatric ward.
Was this at ISB?
No,
Okay.
it was at NPI, Neuropsychological Institute.
Okay.
It was the psychiatry department. But the psychology people were in an old ward where there were, the men's bathroom had 2 tub rooms in it. And we didn't need the tubs anymore, so I said, well, we're going to partition, we'll let the men have the urinals, and I'll take the the tubs out and put the beds in.
My goodness.
So I put 2 beds in where the tubs went out. And I said, I think I'm going to need some shielding. Because there was an elevator coming up and so forth. So with no idea what the heck I was doing, I ordered little cubicle acoustic shielding,
Oh, yeah.
which were like cells. You know, they were metal, and they were scarier than heck, because once you put a bed in and put somebody to sleep in them, you then clamp down, you know, and to seal it off. And the poor guys,
I bet their dreams weren't good in that.
they would say, it's too quiet in here. And I had to finally pipe in street noise so they could fall asleep. Didn't need all of that
Oh, well,
shielding.
they were Chicago people.
They were Chicago people, and they missed the buses and the fire engines
The
and
L and all
of
that.
that noise. So we piped in the street noise. But Al came and helped me figure out. He said, well, the first thing you want is lots of outlets. You can never have enough outlets all the way around, you know, to get enough amps to do everything. And we put in 2 modified EEG machines, and I hired Larry Monroe, who had just finished with Al doing his great study on good and poor sleepers. And he was a very good companion. We spent the nights together.
Yeah.
And kept each other awake. And I remember one night, we'd been talking and waiting for REM, and I'd say, Larry, why are those big waves all the way up on the eye channels? And he said, that's REM. And I said, oh, I thought they were delta waves. What are they doing up there? That's REM.
You found it.
But we had good times together, and we did some good work together too.
So my next question is about what it was like in terms of sharing your science. You just told me a little bit about some of the people who had helped you get started and who must have influenced you. But can you remember anything about the sleep conferences back then? Because we're at a sleep conference here now in Minneapolis. What were they like back in the day?
My first one was at Stanford. That must have been 64.
Okay.
And I had just done the hallucinogenic drug study, which Al piloted for me. He was my first sleeper.
Got it.
But he couldn't fall asleep on the drug.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's another story.
So did you present the
I did.
hallucinogenic drug study at that first conference?
I did
at Stanford?
indeed. And it was so small, we sat around one conference table.
Isn't that something?
And it was very chummy.
Uh-huh.
You know, it was a small group, mostly young men who enjoyed playing touch football and played poker together. And I felt too old, too female, too different, you know. I was sort of a fringy kind of person in that crowd. But they listened, and they asked me good questions. And I said, that's for me. This is, now I feel at home.
So you were a member of the club?
Yes.
Good, even though you didn't get out there and do any touch football.
No touch football. They didn't invite me to play poker with them. But, you know, they were all a little younger, and this was their first career. I was on my, not only second, probably
sure, but you
third.
ran a big lab, and you were director of that unit, and at UIC, right?
Yes.
So,
but I mean,
you had standing.
yes, and I had a CV with a lot of publications by that point. So I was able to hold my own, but I wasn't really like them. And it was very much all male. There were a few women in the field, but not in that clubby group of in people. However, being a very stubborn person, I kept going no matter what.
Yeah.
And I did love it. I just felt so at home. In the night, collecting dreams I felt,
You were in your bliss.
yeah, the job of a lifetime. And it was fun going from study to study and learning as you go and building steps of understanding what was going on in the mind at night. And then trying to get better control and better, tighter designs. That all, was just a wonderful exploratory time. Then came the time when I got the offer from Rush to move there to a medical center instead of, by then I was at, the behavioral science department down on Circle Campus,
Right.
not the medical center anymore. And I was teaching heavily. And I had good students. And I had a lab. I had a little 4-bed lab. And
And were you seeing patients?
no.
I
This
see.
was no clinical work. This
Okay.
was all research. And the kids were doing interesting projects, and they were doing master's type work. Steve Lloyd was one of those who stayed with me through a lot of the work after I went to Rush. But most of them, they stopped at a master's and they went and did other things. And by that time, I was beginning to feel that I wanted very much to do patient work. I wanted to do the depression study
Right.
at that point, and I said I need access to patients. So when the offer came to become chairman at Rush, actually I was out at Berkeley for that quarter. I was doing visiting professorship, and I said, no, do your search for a chairman. I'm busy, I'm here, and when I get back to Chicago, if you haven't found a chairman yet, I'll come and visit with you. So they hadn't found a chairman, and they asked me to come over, and I met with search committee and then deans and so forth, and finally with the with the president. And that was the one that really cinched it.
Made you an offer you couldn't turn down?
Well, he said, what do you want? And I
question.
said, I want to open a sleep disorder service. It was a long pause, and he's dead now, but he was a very elegant North Shore socialite type, very elegant. And he stared at me with his steely blue eyes, and he said, what's that?
Oh no.
And I had to say, well, I think I have been doing research in sleep for some time now, and I think I'm ready to start helping patients. What patients? Well, patients who can't sleep. Well, we write a script for that. And I said, well, I think we need to know more before we write a script.
Ahead of your time.
Anyway, he said, well, what would it take? And I said, well, I want space for at least 5 bedrooms.
Good for you.
And it has to have a bathroom, at least one, for patients only, no animals.
Oh my goodness.
And, because that was Al's lab,
Right,
was always
yes.
full of animals.
I had the pleasure of seeing that lab sort of at the tail end, and the bathtub with the
Alligators.
reptiles. Yes, there you go.
You go to sit down in the toilet and
And you've got company.
the alligator is staring at you. That is not fun. Anyway, so I asked for space, and I said, now I have some equipment that I can move, because it was grant-bought equipment. I said, I've got 2, but they're getting old. I'd like to have some new equipment. And he said, what's the total? What do you need?
You wanted the number slid across the table, huh?
So he said, okay, go
Good
do
for
it.
you.
So I had to promise to be a good chairman, to build the department, to do, whatever it was in terms of organizing the medical college teaching program in behavioral science, and do my research and see patients and wear many hats.
Yes.
But it was great fun.
How do you think that influenced your thinking once you had your own lab and were gonna do your own work and start in that direction of looking at dreams and looking at mood, how did your psychology background and training influence what you did?
Very much so. For one thing, let me segue back from the mood studies and talk about sleep apnea.
Mm-hmm.
Because just as I began seeing patients, it was the time at which apnea had just boomed on the field, and there were many apneic patients coming asking for help. And although CPAP had just been introduced, it wasn't yet the primary treatment. It was surgery.
Still tracheostomy or
they were
oral
traching,
surgery.
or they were, doing the rotor-rooter. But we had a lot of patients who had trachs and then wanted to have them closed.
Right.
And we had to see whether it was possible to close them and so forth. But I felt this is barbaric. I mean, it was the first place that I felt these people are not being treated in the
How
best
can this be the standard of care?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That surgery was overkill in many cases, and there must be ways to treat people who were mild that were not ready for surgery, and that the surgeries were really pretty drastic then and not always effective at all.
Yeah.
Some of the rotor-rooters were terrible.
People would suffer and have lots of pain and still have rip-roaring sleep apnea.
Exactly.
So you came up with some other stuff.
Well, I fell into a lot of stuff. And one of the first things I fell into was Charlie Samuelson, who was a psychiatrist, little old man, who was a big snorer. And he came in to see me one day with a brown paper bag and said, I'd like to show you something. I think I have invented an anti-snoring device.
Oh, cool.
And I said, well, let me see what you've got. And he opened his brown paper bag and he pulled out a piece of, it wasn't plastic, it was a material that was like waxy material. And I said, what is that? He said, well, he wears it every night and he puts it in and sticks his tongue out into a little compartment in the front, and that holds his tongue forward through suction, and he doesn't snore. And his wife will testify. His wife was lovely, piano teacher, lovely lady, Natalie. And he said, I think this is an anti-snoring device you might be interested in. I said, well, Dr. Samuelson, two things. One is, I think you may have invented an anti-apnea device. He said, what's that? So I gave him some papers to read and some references to look up. And I said, you need to think about sleep apnea in terms of this device. And then the second thing is, I can't test it or do anything with it in the material you've given me. It's not hygienic.
Right.
You can't autoclave it, And if you put it in somebody's mouth and they chomp on it, they could aspirate all that stuff right into the lungs, and you'd have a worse problem.
So you were wearing
snoring.
your chairman liability hat at that moment.
Well, lots of things.
Do no harm.
Yeah, right. So I said, if you can get this into a material that we can keep clean and that will be safe for the patients to wear, I would be very interested in testing it. And son of a gun, he did. He went home and he got it into a nice material that was softer and was a compound that worked very well. We tested it and it worked like a charm. And it was so exciting because the first paper we wrote on it went into JAMA and it went all over the world quickly. I had, the Sultan of SWAT coming, flying in to get a TRD, a tongue retaining device.
That's great.
And I said, Charlie, are you ready for this?
The onslaught.
Yeah, I said, look, this is your device. You own it. I'm happy to do the research with you, for you, but one size is not going to fit all. You're going to have to get somebody involved in manufacturing this, and you're going to have to be able to size it, at least 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. And, there's some things we have to do, and we have to get approval. We can't go any further until. But he was a quick learner. He was elderly then, semi-retired. I think he was doing some psychiatry for Illinois Masonic, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And a charming little man. And he
started a revolution.
He started the revolution. And, I got funding for the studies, and we learned a lot about who wouldn't wear it, and how severe we could go with just a tongue retaining device. And that has not really been featured in the literature, that there's some very severe cases that are perfectly fine with just a TRD. And, it's now that if they're mild or moderate and they have rejected CPAP, then you can use an oral appliance. Mm-hmm. But I had severe cases, in fact I still have some, that come back to one of our dentists from far away to have new TRDs made.
Because that's what does the trick for them. That's great.
The trick for them. Well, after we had worked with the tongue retaining device for a while, I recognized in retesting them in the lab with the TRD in that and out, and comparing those, these were largely positional apneic patients that were successful in using the TRD. And positional meaning that they were really more than twice as severe when they slept on their back as on their side. And that was just a rule of thumb criterion I used to label them positional. But the positional people, really, you had to get the tongue from retrolapsing into the top of the oral opening. And so, by having them sleep on their side where the gravity helped the tongue fall forward instead of back, that if we could train them to be side sleepers, we were well ahead of the game. Some people only needed that training. And we tried first a beeper on the chest, and the wives didn't like
every time they were not on their back, it would beep?
Yeah.
That's as bad as having a snoring spouse.
if they were beeping to get them to turn over. Yeah,
the elbow method.
It saved them from having to elbow them, but it woke them up.
Right.
So they didn't like the beeper, and so I wanted a silent thing that would help, and we developed the tennis ball T-shirt, which we sold for $10.
Yep.
For many, many years.
I remember them.
And it went all over the country.
Yep.
Males.
You had somebody from Ukrainian village who used to make them, right?
That's right. She would sew the pockets on the back with a little lid on it so the balls wouldn't jump out. Yeah, and so for $10 we had the cheapest, most effective sleep apnea treatment for many patients for a long time. And that was fun. But I wanted to move to what psychology had to do with as an influence in my treating of the apneics, and then we'll go on to other areas, Katie. But the next thing that really got me involved with thinking about patients as a psychologist does is for the sleep apneics who could not keep a CPAP on or didn't want to keep a CPAP on, but really needed one, and it was really helpful when they did. So the adherence to CPAP treatment was a problem, and
it's still a problem.
Still a problem. And we know that, within a year, 50% are going to drop out. And often at night, if they had to get up to the bathroom, they'd take it off and never put it back on, which meant they missed the worst part of the night for
absolutely.
apnea in REM. So I felt we really had to involve the spouse in the bed partner in helping that patient adhere to the treatment. So I said, we need a queen-size bed. Most labs don't have a queen-size bed.
In the lab.
In the lab. So I said, I'm going to take one bedroom and refurnish it for a queen-size bed so we can have couples sleep together, monitoring them both. What does his apnea do to her sleep? Number one. And then, can we train her to stay in the bed, not exit to sleep quietly elsewhere, if she understands that a CPAP will make him quiet? So after we ordered the CPAP for him, I think we gave them 2 weeks of training at home, then brought him back for the couples with the CPAP on. Could she sleep better? Because most of the wives had rotten sleep when he was still being diagnosed, hadn't yet gotten a CPAP.
Adapted to it.
Yeah. Well, once he had 2 weeks on the CPAP and she slept with him, her sleep was infinitely better. His sleep was much, much better, and they were happily living together again in the same bed. Many of them. In fact, one couple that we had do a couple of TV programs, on this topic. They wanted to see a couple and talk to them. One of them is a charming couple. She said, I had not slept with that man for 7 years, and I was darned if I was going to do it for his sake when she called me that I had to participate.
Oh, right.
So she said, I want him to be helped, but I don't want to share a bed with him. And I said, come on, give it a go. It's only for 2 nights. One will be before he's treated, one after. You're going to
You'll both sleep better.
You'll both sleep better. So they were just so charming because on TV she told the story of having industrial strength earplugs, and she opened a closet. There were packages and packages of these industrial strength earplugs that she used. But mostly she would start in the bed and have to leave anyway. After he was treated, she said they snuggle every night. And it was just so sweet. Anyway, but that is taking into effect that you don't have just one patient, because sleep is a shared
activity.
Yes. And you have 2 patients. If one can't sleep, if the other is got a sleep disorder, he may be sleeping, he thinks he's sleeping, but he's keeping her awake. And so I think it's wonderful that people are beginning to hear that message and to do some research on the effect.
Couples.
Yeah, couples.
No, and you have had a huge influence on that. Plus, I think of all the trainees that you've had that you've taught to think about, including myself. It's not just one person in the bedroom; it's 2, and it affects them both. So, that's key. We share an interest in sleep and mood.
Yes.
And I am hoping that you'll tell us a little bit about those dream studies that started with the divorcing couples, and maybe get into a little bit about how the findings from waking them from dreams and hearing about their dream content led to your theory of the 24-hour mind.
Wonderful question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think I got started with the idea of doing the divorce study to get at depression, because depression was a very high proportion of divorcing people do have a depressive episode. It may be short and self-terminating, transient, but often severe enough to be diagnosable as a major depressive episode. And I was looking for a real-life event that was highly emotional to test the idea that dreams do have some function, and Hughes had read the Louis Brieger's study that was published, Brieger, Hunter, and Lane, on elective surgery patients. So these are patients who have chosen to have surgery to correct something, and he put them in the lab for 5 nights before the surgery, collected dreams, and 5 nights after. And did this wonderful, poor piece of research, but wonderful clinical study on the dreams before and after, and what people were processing in the dreams about the upcoming surgery.
Their anxieties and so forth.
Their anxieties and or their fantasies.
Oh,
They were
yeah.
going to be so much better, and they were going to be prettier, and they were going to be dancing, and all kinds of things. And it was an interesting model, and I said, darn it, he's got it. Because all of the experimental studies on the function of dreams that looked at trying to do experimental
Dream collection?
no, interventions,
Oh, okay.
like neutral films versus horror films.
I gotcha.
Never worked.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't affect the dreams one bit.
Mm-hmm.
No intrusion into the dreams, no incorporation of the images, nothing. I mean, over and over and over. The experimental stuff just didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you need real
Naturalistic
life,
stuff.
naturalistic studies. So being interested in depression and the fact that so many divorcing people had depression, I said, there are lots of divorces going on in this world. I can get big samples, but I have to be in a medical center. That's what really made me take the job at Rush. The divorcing studies, and there were a series of them. It's not one study. I started out with women only, then it was women and men, and then it was divorcing who were depressed and were not depressed, and then the third group of perfectly fine, healthy normals.
Yep.
What do they do overnight in terms of mood regulation? So it was a series from which I learned a lot, and I stuck with it about 20, 25 years worth of funding. Thank goodness for NIMH. They stuck with the studies. We knew a lot about the sleep disorder of depression from Kupfer's work and that whole Pittsburgh group. You know, they really had taught us about the markers, sleep markers, and that something was wrong with REM.
Right.
REM looked like a broken system.
Yep.
That it was occurring too early, often too long, the first,
Too intense.
and too intense. The eye movements going off like fireworks. Something wrong with the REM system. So what's going on
With the dreams.
in the content of those REMs? And that's what I started out seeing. Do those people who are divorcing without depression look very different in the dreams than those who have the depression? Just the women?
I think, somebody in the hall.
Okay. But what I really learned out of that, I think, Katie, is that I could predict from night one of the depressed people
Who was going to get better?
who was going to remit without treatment. No medication, no psychotherapy, nothing. Just living. The dreams would say whether they were processing this in a healthy way or not. And what turned out to be a healthy way? One, they dreamed about the problem. The spouse, the ex-spouse, was in the dream as a character. Two, they dreamed with affect. And three, images drew on some older associated images. It may be they were younger in age. The characters went back to high school times or something, or they were in their old apartment that they hadn't lived in for 20 years. Or, there was something in the dreams that say you are amalgamating present problem with older images of previous problems that were emotionally related. If they were doing that, they were going to be working in a positive direction. And that turned out to be so beautifully diagrammed with the affect in the first dream, second dream, third dream.
Across the night.
Across the night. That if you took them all, you get negatives going down, positives going up. The depressed who are not going to recover, the negatives went up and the positives were flat and low. If you get that picture on night one, you can predict they're going to be in trouble. They're going to need some help to get over that depression. So that was very useful information for me. I thought we could really tell people, you really need to get into treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not going to get better on its own. Go get some help. And we could tell other people, I think you're going to be okay. Do you want to come in and talk? Fine. If you want to keep a dream diary at home and talk about those, fine. And I had people who did stay with me and worked at their dreams as they remembered them,
mm-hmm.
and got a lot out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I really felt so strongly that this dream system is a natural health-producing
mm-hmm. Well,
mood regulation
yeah.
system. It is a piece of nature that we should bless ourselves for. And like my mother used to say, you know, you're hurting, go sleep on it, and
yeah.
wake up with a good dream.
Well,
So-
and the dreams let you identify, basically separate phenotypes of the depressed and non-depressed based on content. So
Exactly.
you mentioned there were many physiologic, empiric hints that there was a broken system, but this added a psychological piece, certainly,
Well,
that separated
absolutely.
people out clinically. I think that's a remarkable contribution.
Well, you know, the dreams were so vividly different.
Mhm.
I mean, those people who were depressed and not going to work it through, the affect was flat, the dreams were short,
Mhm.
they were dull,
Mhm.
they just weren't working at the issues that they had. And so they were dramatically different. A lot of them are in the book. I used to pull a lot of those for illustrations. But after that work was published, I was aware of Mark Soames' work. And I had read his book, and I was invited to London, and he too was at the same meeting. We were both speaking. And I was just blown away by the fact that we now had a model that separated REM and dreaming and saw them as two separate systems that conveniently REM provided a good home for the activity of dreaming, but if you can't REM, it doesn't mean you're not going to be dreaming anyway. And his brain injured and surgical cases really pinpointed where in the brain, and it is not in the pons, it's in the frontal cortex, and it's very much up there. And following his work, which really did not get incorporated into this thinking in this country at all. They thought of him as sort of an oddball also, and he went back to South Africa to teach, and it was kind of blown off. But he had trained a young Chinese psychologist, Calvin Yu. Do you know Yu's work?
I don't.
I
But
recommend
you
him.
do.
I recommend him to you.
Sorry.
Calvin Yu did a series of studies, which he started with Mark, but on stroke patients.
Mhm.
So it wasn't brain injured or surgical cases with stroke, but localized stroke. And he has cases where the pons is intact and there's no dreaming. And the opposite, where there's no dreaming. No, I just said that one. where it's the other way around. Where the pons has been destroyed, the dreams are still functioning. So you can dream
a
without...
study that shows you can dream without the pons.
You can dream without the pons. And that this is not... His stroke patients didn't lose all language. Some of them had language fine, but no dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And that really clinches the case that it is the localized mid-frontal area that is the center for dreaming. And that really frees us from the arguments that dreaming is a byproduct of REM, and therefore that you can say there is no meaning in this initially random imaging that then when we wake we associate to. No way. If you look at people before they sleep and you know what's on their mind, and you do the dreams across the night, and then you in the morning test their mood and the same things you looked at before sleep, you get an effect from that intervening variable of dreaming.
And that's consistent with this sort of newer idea of local sleep. So yeah, you can
Absolutely.
have the REM that the brainstem is generating, and then you can have dreaming in another place in the brain, and
Absolutely.
they can be temporally co-localized.
That's right.
But not necessarily.
And if you're sleep deprived, intensely sleep deprived, Tononi's
They
rats,
can dissociate.
yes, they look awake,
Mm-hmm.
but part of the brain is asleep, and they make many more errors, and they're feisty, and they have bad moods.
Right. They're depressed.
They're depressed, right.
I wanted to ask you a little, you spoke a little while ago about being the first woman or one of the only women at the sleep meetings, and I did want to segue to that a little bit and talk about what it was like to have so many female firsts, because many of us in this field look up to you for being one of the first women in sleep, and I wonder what it was like to, and is like to wear that hat.
Well, to tell you the truth, I got bugged at a very early APSS meeting in New York by a man who died too soon, who, after I had given a talk that didn't go over very well, he pulled me aside and he said, "You have to study women. This whole field is being built on young, male, healthy medical students. You're the woman. You can test women. We need that data. Do it." And he was very forceful. He said, that's your role. You've got it. You've got a whole half
Wanted
of...
to jam it down your throat, basically.
Yeah, but half of the population we're
Ignoring.
that our data may or may not fit.
Mhm.
We don't know. We're making pronouncements about sleep. We need to study women. And that took me a while to do, because at that time, Katie, you couldn't get women to come into the lab.
Mhm.
For one thing, it wasn't nice.
Or, right, dignified, ladylike.
Exactly. That you don't come sleep for money or
Mhm.
something.
Right.
And they wore beehive hairdos
Uh-huh.
that were all
Can you
sprayed.
imagine with the collodion? Oy.
They didn't want to destroy their hairdos.
Mhm.
And it was not easy to get women to come in and volunteer for studies.
So you felt, as a woman scientist, you shouldered the whole weight of
I've
having
gotta
women
do it.
participants on yourself, because you were one of the few women.
And that's one of the reasons why I started the divorce study
Uh-huh.
with just a woman's sample.
Uh-huh.
Because I could get them to come in because they were hurting.
Yeah.
And the sample of women taught me that I really need to do the men too. In this case, it was the other way
Sure.
around. But the women were so wonderfully grateful
Mhm.
to have that access to their dreams and somebody who listened and would talk to them about it. That it was very, very rewarding. And I really, I felt bonded with that sample of women.
Mm-hmm.
However, I knew that I had to look at the men, because if they were different in what worked and didn't work for them, that was important to know.
Absolutely.
So we both did both genders. But as a woman scientist, I had all the troubles that all women scientists have, and that is, you want to have a full life, you want to be a mommy.
You read my mind. I was going to specifically ask you to comment about being a working mom.
Being a working mom is not easy, particularly a working mom who works nights,
Mm-hmm.
which I did for many years. For about 15 years, I did all my own recording. So I would hire baby sleepers who came in.
Just stay
not sitters.
overnight.
They came overnight, and then I came home in the morning and got the kids up to school. But
When did you sleep?
very little. Then I went to sleep when the kids were in school till noon, and then I went into and
Do
did
your
afternoon.
real job.
I did afternoon classes. You know, I always said I had to do afternoon classes. But my colleagues were really angry at me. Why do you have to study at night? Why can't you study people during the day like everybody else does in the field? I said, well, the night is very full of interesting psychological
You
questions.
should have said it's all circadian rhythms.
I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know it.
We're not going to get REM at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Oh, that's so funny. So, and your kids must have been very proud of you, and
They were.
we
And
should
I
give a
would-
shout out to them.
I would bring records home, and I taught them to score, and we'd lay them out on the dining room table.
That's a good idea.
They all did
Put them to
score.
work.
Absolutely, they loved it. They
That's
wrote short
great.
stories about Al Rexhoff because they loved him. And, you know, they'd write stories about him and his rats. He'd
That's
sleep
terrific.
deprived. So, yes, it became family issues. Yeah.
So you
Family
worked it
time.
out. You
Yeah.
managed your full life and having it all.
Yes and no, yeah, because you always have to sacrifice some of that. You know, when you're making choices like being on study sections, you're going to be out of town. I mean, we didn't do them by phone. You know, we did site visits, as Mary will tell you. That's how I met Mary. I site visited her about her sleep camp stuff for her grant. And, you know, you really had to. I often brought my mother to visit so that I could be out of
So
town.
the extended family were
Yes,
helpers. That
yes.
is a tradition that continues today, I think, among many
Many.
working science moms.
Yes, yeah. So you find ways, but I had to find them on my own,
Yeah.
you know, because there was no
You
tradition for
didn't
it.
have a mentor to say this is how you
Uh-uh.
have it all,
Uh-uh.
like we lucky ladies do
Well,
in
no.
you. That's great.
Yeah, but it was worth it. As I say, you find what you love to do and then do it.
Got it.
Keep doing it.